Imagine you're on the bridge of a container ship. It's 4 in the morning, you've been at sea for 11 days, crossing the Indian Ocean from the Persian Gulf. The engines are a low, constant hum below the deck. Someone has made coffee. The radar screen shows open water in every direction. Then the coastlines begin to appear. Not dramatically, not in any way that would make you set down the coffee. They just start to close in from either side, the Malay Peninsula to the north, the Indonesian island of Sumatra to the south. Two long walls of land narrowing around your ship until the water between them is barely 1.7 miles wide. This is the Strait of Malacca. By ocean standards, it's a river. But through this river passes, every single day, roughly a third of all global maritime trade. The oil moving from the Persian Gulf to China and Japan. The electronics flowing west toward Europe and America. Container after container, around the clock, year after year. Your ship is one of 80 or 90 crossing today. Tomorrow, 80 more. There is no realistic alternative. The next viable route adds weeks to the journey and tens of thousands in fuel costs, so the world goes through here. Somewhere at the far end of this corridor sits a city-state of 6 million people on an island you can drive across in 40 minutes. No oil. No farmland. Not enough fresh water to supply itself. It imports almost everything its people eat, and it is one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. A global financial center managing $4 trillion in assets, one of the busiest ports in the world. Per capita income higher than France, higher than Japan, higher than the United Kingdom. This isn't a natural endowment. It isn't colonial inheritance or a resource windfall. It's the result of a strategy, deliberate and sometimes ruthless, to turn a geographic position into a global system the world cannot afford to bypass. This is how Singapore built an empire on a strait 1.7 miles wide. The strait has been a trade corridor for 2,000 years. Arab merchants, Chinese junks, Portuguese caravels, British steamships, all moved through this same narrow passage between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. East Asia's economies sit on the Pacific side. The Middle East's oil, the Indian subcontinent, Europe's markets, all sit to the west. The strait is the hinge, the only realistic hinge. Geographers call places like this chokepoints, locations where geography concentrates movement so severely that controlling the passage gives leverage over everything flowing through it. But here's the problem. Being adjacent to a choke point does not automatically make you wealthy. It makes you geographically important. Those two things are not the same. Singapore, for most of its history, illustrated the difference perfectly, and not in the flattering direction. The island was called Temasek, a small Malay fishing settlement surrounded by mangrove swamp and jungle. The trade moved through the strait for centuries. The commercial benefit moved elsewhere. The city of Malacca, 60 miles to the north, captured most of the regional commerce. The Portuguese controlled it, then the Dutch. Singapore, the position and the island, remained largely irrelevant to any of it. Then, in February of 1819, a British officer named Stamford Raffles stepped ashore. He was not looking at what the island had, he was looking at where it sat. The British needed a trading post at the eastern mouth of the strait, somewhere to service vessels moving between India and China, somewhere to challenge Dutch commercial dominance. Raffles chose this island specifically for its position. He negotiated a treaty with the local sultan, raised a British flag, and made one decision that would define everything that followed. He declared Singapore a free port. Free. No tariffs, no duties, no fees on cargo entering or leaving. Every other port in the region charged. Singapore didn't. Within 3 years, the population grew from roughly 1,000 people to over 10,000. Within a decade, 30,000. Merchants came because the friction was gone. Capital followed the merchants. Infrastructure followed the capital. The cycle compounded. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869 and compressed the Europe to Asia route dramatically, Singapore was perfectly positioned to catch the new flow. A half-century of British investment, docks, warehouses, telegraph cables, financial houses, meant that when the trade volume surged, Singapore surged with it. The first principle was already in place. Geography creates opportunity. Policy determines whether you capture it. I spent time looking at the other port cities that sat near the strait: Penang, Malacca, Batavia. They all had centuries of history. Some had earlier starts than Singapore. When you find the answer to why Singapore pulled ahead, it's uncomfortable in its simplicity. The difference wasn't location. They were all near the location. The difference was the decisions made by the people holding the position. In 1963, Singapore joined the newly independent Federation of Malaysia. The merger lasted 2 years. In August of 1965, Singapore was expelled, not because it was failing, but because it was inconvenient. Its Chinese majority population and its economic ambitions created political tensions the Federation didn't want to manage. On August 9, 1965, Lee Kuan Yew appeared on television to announce that Singapore was now a sovereign nation. He was visibly shaken. He cried. He called it a moment of anguish, not celebration. No army, no water supply, no natural resources, neighbors who had just rejected it. That should have been the beginning of decline. The immediate crisis was practical. Singapore's port, the economic engine the British had built, was being strangled by labor disputes. Dock workers' unions were among the most organized political forces in the new country. Strikes were frequent. Cargo sat on docks while ships waited at anchor. Shippers were routing around Singapore. Lee Kuan Yew's government made a decision that was politically expensive. It restructured the entire industrial relations framework, brought the labor movement under a government-aligned federation, absorbed the backlash, and redirected investment into mechanization. Cranes, container handling systems, computerized logistics. By the mid-1970s, Singapore's container turnaround times were among the fastest in the world. Ships that had been routing to alternatives came back. The logic matters. The geographic position created the potential. Efficient infrastructure converted potential into revenue. But the infrastructure was only possible because a government was willing to pay political costs that most governments avoid paying. By 1990, Singapore was among the world's busiest container ports. The model looked complete. Strait plus free port plus efficient infrastructure plus political stability equaled prosperity. Lee Kuan Yew had already been working on a different problem. Physical trade is fragile, shipping lanes shift, new canals get dug. If Singapore's entire prosperity depended on the volume of cargo moving through a strait it didn't control, it was always one major infrastructure project away from irrelevance. The government began building a second machine. If you're finding this useful, hit like before we go further. What comes next is the part most accounts of Singapore skip entirely. What's most surprising about Singapore's rise isn't the port. The port makes sense: position, investment, efficiency. What's surprising is what Singapore built on top of it: a parallel financial architecture that, over time, became more valuable than the port itself, and it was built from things that appear on no map. In 1968, Singapore established an offshore currency market, the Asian dollar market, allowing foreign banks to conduct dollar-denominated transactions outside U.S. Federal Reserve restrictions. The timing was deliberate. Vietnam War spending had flooded Asia with American dollars that needed somewhere productive to go. Hong Kong was the existing regional financial hub, but it carried complications from its colonial status and its uncertain long-term relationship with China. Singapore positioned itself as the alternative. What Singapore offered was not natural, it was manufactured. Independent courts with genuine enforcement power. Low corruption, not as a stated aspiration but as a measurable reality. Regulatory predictability. A legal environment that made foreign capital feel as secure as New York or London, but closer to Asian markets than either. Capital doesn't flow toward warmth, capital flows toward predictability. Singapore built predictability as a deliberate policy tool. By the 1980s, Singapore was the third largest foreign exchange trading center in the world. By the 2000s, it was managing private wealth that rivaled Switzerland. Today it administers roughly $4 trillion in financial assets, more than Germany's entire annual economic output, held in accounts belonging to people who don't live there. The strait was still running. The port was still operating. Singapore had created a revenue system that didn't require either. Here's what this reveals about how geography actually functions in economic development. Location creates opportunity. It does not create outcomes. Singapore was adjacent to one of the world's most important trade corridors for centuries before anyone figured out how to capture the value flowing past it. The port infrastructure, the financial architecture, the regulatory frameworks had to be deliberately built by a government willing to make costly decisions across decades. Most countries with geographic advantages wait for them to generate returns automatically. Singapore engineered the capture. That's the distinction. Here's the part most accounts of Singapore leave out. The same political system that enabled these long-term economic decisions is not a liberal democracy. Press freedom has been systematically restricted since independence. Political opposition has been structurally marginalized. The People's Action Party has won every election since 1965, partly through genuine popular support and partly through electoral structures, legal tools, and campaign restrictions that make serious opposition nearly impossible to sustain. The government has used defamation proceedings against foreign journalists, opposition politicians, and domestic critics for 60 years. The concentrated executive power that allowed Singapore to push through labor reforms against union resistance, to build sovereign wealth funds without competing fiscal pressures, to make 20-year infrastructure commitments without electoral cycles disrupting them, that is the same concentration of power that suppressed political challenge. The efficiency of the economic system and the structure of the political system are not separate stories. That's not a coincidence. Block F. Viewer question. What do you think? Is Singapore's model genuinely transferable, or does it require a specific form of political control to produce? That's not rhetorical. Leave it in the comments. It's the one worth arguing about. The 1997 Asian financial crisis tested the model directly. Currency collapses across the region. Banking failures in Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, capital flight and social instability. Singapore was not immune, its markets contracted, export volumes fell, growth turned negative for the first time in decades. But Singapore had been doing something quietly since the 1970s. Every surplus generated by the port and the financial sector, rather than being spent on expanded programs, was invested. GIC, the Government Investment Corporation, and Temasek Holdings had been accumulating sovereign wealth for decades. By 1997, Singapore had the reserves to absorb regional contagion without emergency external financing. While neighbors required IMF intervention and devastating austerity, Singapore stabilized and waited. The regional crisis that was destroying other economies was driving capital toward Singapore, toward the stable and predictable. The instability made Singapore's infrastructure more valuable, not less. The spiral ran in one direction. Singapore's position is not permanent. China's Belt and Road Initiative has built overland infrastructure, pipelines and rail corridors, designed partly to reduce maritime dependence on the Malacca Passage. New deep-water port capacity is being developed in Myanmar and along Malaysia's east coast. The shipping economics that made Singapore structurally necessary are slowly shifting. Will Singapore maintain its position as Southeast Asia's premier financial hub through 2035? Yes or no in the comments. We read every one. The Strait of Malacca is still 1.7 miles wide at its narrowest point. The container ships still pass, 80 or 90 a day. The navigator at 4 in the morning is still watching the coastlines narrow, still drinking the same coffee, still crossing the same water. One detail that stayed with me: Singapore still imports almost all of its water. The island receives heavy rainfall, but its reservoir capacity cannot supply a dense urban population. It pipes water from Malaysia under a treaty that has been politically contentious since it was signed in 1962. It processes rainwater. It purifies recycled wastewater to drinking standards, a program called New Water. Water independence appears in Singapore's national security documents alongside military vulnerabilities. A country with no natural resources, no domestic water supply, no agricultural land, and the highest home ownership rate in the world. Near universal literacy. Life expectancy 2 years longer than the United States. Lee Kuan Yew cried on television in 1965 because he was afraid. The island had nothing except its position. He spent the next 3 decades building everything else, using the position to pay for all of it. The ship passes through, the city watches, the fees are paid in 100 currencies, through 100 mechanisms, by companies that have never thought about Singapore as a country, only as an address on a shipping contract, a clearing account in a financial statement, a port call on a voyage plan. That is the empire, not of territory, not of military force, an empire of position, of infrastructure and institutional reliability built so deliberately that the world made itself dependent on it without quite noticing it had. The strait is still narrow. The question Singapore has never been able to fully answer, and the one its planners think about more than anything else, is what happens when the world finds its way around it. If you want to understand how geography shapes power and wealth, and why it doesn't always work the way we expect, that's what Mapped is here to show you. Subscribe. There's more.